Welcome to Nazir Fears, where fear finds you. Do you dare to enter a world of unspeakable horror and chilling mysteries? If you love creepy true stories, urban legends, haunted places, and terrifying experiences, you're in the right place.
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The Haunting of the Silent Forest. Ethan Calloway had always been drawn to the wilderness. As a child, he spent countless hours exploring the woods near his family's cabin, climbing trees and chasing the thrill of the unknown. But now, in his late 20s, his connection with nature had grown more profound. He needed silence, solitude, and the sense of being lost in the vastness of the forest to feel truly alive. This time, he was venturing deep into the silent forest, a notorious patch of wilderness known for its eerie atmosphere. The locals spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, whispers of ghostly figures, unexplainable noises, and the inexplicable disappearances of hikers over the years had left the area shrouded in mystery. But Ethan didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in the quiet calm that nature offered, and he was determined to prove that the tales of the silent forest were just superstition. It was late afternoon when he arrived. He parked his truck at the edge of the forest, grabbed his backpack, and began his hike deeper into the trees. The sun dipped lower behind the towering pines, casting long shadows across the trail. Ethan welcomed the feeling of isolation, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, and the crisp air filling his lungs. As the hours passed, the forest became darker and quieter. The birds stopped singing, and even the usual rustling of small animals ceased. There was no wind. The stillness grew heavier, almost suffocating, and Ethan began to feel uneasy, despite his best efforts to ignore it. He pushed forward, determined to reach a small clearing he'd heard about. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. But as he trekked further, he noticed something strange. The trail didn't seem to lead where it should. The trees appeared closer, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, almost as if they were closing in on him. Ethan checked his watch. It was nearly twilight now. He paused, wondering if he should turn back, but then heard something in the distance, a faint sound, like a child crying. Probably just an animal, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But the cry came again, this time clearer, a hollow, pained wail that seemed to echo through the trees. His heart skipped a beat. That wasn't an animal. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice carrying into the eerie stillness. There was no answer. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of life, but only the sound of his own breath filled the air. Shaking off the chills crawling down his spine, Ethan decided to ignore it. The forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind, he reasoned. Maybe it was a distant echo of something far off. But as he pressed on, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around him deepened. Then, in the periphery of his vision, he saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was too far to make out any details, but Ethan felt an odd sensation creeping up his neck. The figure was standing still, staring in his direction. His pulse quickened. He tried to convince himself it was a tree stump or a trick of the fading light. But the figure remained, unmoving. "Hello?" Ethan called again, his voice more forceful now. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. Ethan hesitated. The forest was silent once more, and the figure remained eerily still. After a long moment, he decided to approach. With each step he took, the figure became clearer. It was a man, hunched over, wearing ragged clothes. His face was hidden beneath a thick mess of matted hair, but his posture seemed unnatural, like he was frozen mid-movement. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. The man didn't answer, but suddenly he turned his head. The movement was sharp, too quick to be natural, and when he looked at Ethan, it was with eyes that were not fully there. Blackened, hollow, lifeless eyes. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing in his chest. Then the man spoke, his voice rasping as if it came from the depths of a long-forgotten grave. "Leave this place, before it takes you too." Before Ethan could react, the man lurched forward, reaching out with skeletal hands, his movements jerky and unnerving. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a cold dread washed over him. This was not just any man. It was something else, something unnatural. Instinct took over. Ethan turned and ran, his legs pumping as he pushed himself through the dense forest. Behind him, he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, uneven and hurried, following him through the darkened woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, the trail now completely lost to him as the shadows grew thicker and the air colder. His pulse raced as he sprinted, the figure's voice echoing in his mind. "Leave before it takes you!" Ethan didn't know what it was that was chasing him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he got out of the forest. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the woods, his mind clouded by panic. The figure's words echoed in his ears, and the forest around him seemed to shift and warp, making it impossible to find his bearings. He could still hear the haunting footsteps behind him, following him relentlessly. They grew louder, closer. His heart hammered against his chest, and a cold sweat clung to his skin. He couldn't keep up this pace much longer. The trees were thick and tangled, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further he ran, the more disorienting the woods became. It was as if the forest itself was alive, shifting around him, preventing his escape. Ethan stumbled, nearly losing his footing as he collided with a large rock. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself back onto his feet. Panic clawed at his mind. He had to get out. He couldn't be caught by whatever was chasing him. He needed a plan. Turning sharply, he veered off the path, hoping to find a way out of the forest. But it was as if the trees were closing in on him, their trunks narrowing with each step, pushing him deeper into the heart of the woods. He heard the footsteps again, now accompanied by a guttural growl, a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through his veins. Then a sudden noise stopped him in his tracks. It was a voice, a whisper, no louder than a breath on the wind. "Ethan!" His name was drawn out, hauntingly familiar. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. How did it know his name? The whisper came again, closer this time, as if the trees themselves were speaking to him. "You should have left when you had the chance." Ethan spun around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. His eyes darted between the shadowed trunks, the forest seemingly holding its breath. Then, from behind one of the trees, a figure emerged. It was the same man, the one from earlier, but now he was different. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes wide and hollow, and his body seemed to be contorted in unnatural ways. His limbs jerked with every movement, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and blood-red tears streamed down his face. "You should have left," the man repeated, his voice now a raspy, growling echo. "You're not the first to trespass." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't know what this thing was, but he could feel its malevolent presence, like a weight pressing against his chest. Every instinct told him to run. But his legs felt like they were made of lead, his body frozen in place by the sheer terror of it all. Suddenly the man's lips curled into a sickening grin. "It's too late for you now." Before Ethan could react, the ground beneath him began to shake violently. The trees groaned as if they were alive, their roots twisting and rising from the earth, forming a barrier around him. The forest was closing in, trapping him. "No," Ethan whispered, his heart sinking. This was no longer just a figure. This was the forest itself, an ancient, vengeful force that had claimed countless souls before him. The figure's twisted body lunged toward him, but as it did, something extraordinary happened. The ground beneath the figure began to crack, splitting open like a chasm. A blinding light erupted from the fissure, and Ethan shielded his eyes. The man screamed, his form disintegrating into the light, his agonized wails carried away by the wind. The forest fell silent again, the eerie stillness returning as quickly as it had disappeared. Ethan, heart pounding, dared not move, still processing the inexplicable events unfolding around him. Then, from the blackness, came the faintest of whispers. "You were warned." Ethan didn't wait to hear more. His legs suddenly found the strength to move, and he bolted through the clearing, the oppressive weight of the forest seeming to lessen with each step. The path ahead opened up, and he finally saw the faint glow of the outside world. His truck, parked at the edge of the forest. Without a second thought, he ran toward it, not daring to look back. He reached the truck and slammed the door shut, hands shaking as he started the engine. The headlights cast an eerie glow into the trees, but there was nothing in sight. Nothing but the silent, foreboding expanse of the silent forest. As Ethan drove away, his mind raced with the images of what he had just witnessed. The man, the forest, the warning. He had barely escaped, but deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The forest had claimed its victims before, and it would claim more. The silence that followed him out of the woods was deafening, and as the truck sped down the road, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just narrowly escaped something far worse than he could ever understand. And the forest? It would always be there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander in. The Unseen Passenger. It was a cold, crisp night as Sarah Brooks drove along the desolate highway. The world outside her car seemed like a blur, the headlights slicing through the inky blackness of the road ahead. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the sound of the tires rolling steadily on the asphalt was the only noise breaking the eerie silence of the night. Sarah had just wrapped up her late shift at the hospital, the exhaustion of hours of caring for patients weighing heavily on her. The drive back home should have been the peaceful end to a long day, but something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, just an odd sense that the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She glanced at her rearview mirror and caught sight of a lone figure standing by the side of the road. She couldn't make out much, but it looked like a man, huddled against the cold, his hand raised as if trying to flag her down. Without thinking, Sarah pulled the car over, her tires skidding slightly on the wet road as she came to a stop. The figure was closer now, his face obscured by a hood, but his presence was unmistakable. "Need a ride?" Sarah asked, her voice sounding louder than she intended in the silence of the car. She rolled down the window just enough to hear him. The man nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't say a word, only opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat. As soon as the door clicked shut, Sarah felt a strange chill sweep through the car, as if the air had suddenly turned colder. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the cold was just the weather. But then, as she stole a glance at him, something about the man's stillness made her uneasy. He sat perfectly upright, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was as if he wasn't really there at all. "Where are you headed?" Sarah asked, trying to break the silence. The man's response was unsettlingly calm. "Anywhere you're going is fine." His voice was low, barely above a whisper, and there was something about it that didn't quite sound real. Sarah nodded, not sure what else to say. She was too tired to keep a conversation going, and the road ahead was long. The only sounds in the car were the hum of the engine and the faint swish of the wipers as they cleared away the mist. As the miles ticked by, Sarah's fatigue began to settle in. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she yawned, trying to stay alert. She glanced at the clock. She still had at least 45 minutes left before she reached home. Her hand rested on the steering wheel, but her mind drifted. A few minutes later, she glanced over at the passenger seat again. The man hadn't moved an inch. His hands were still folded in his lap, his gaze still fixed ahead. There was something unnatural about it, something too still, too perfect. Sarah shook her head, trying to shake the growing unease. She needed sleep. She was imagining things. But then, she noticed something else. The reflection in the rearview mirror didn't match what she saw beside her. The reflection showed the man sitting with his hands clenched at his sides, his head turned slightly as if looking at her. But when she turned to face him, he was still staring straight ahead. Her breath caught in her throat. "Did you just—" she began, but the words caught in her mouth. The man was still silent, his unblinking stare now piercing the air between them. Suddenly the car's lights flickered. The hum of the engine sputtered for a split second before settling again. But Sarah felt it, a wave of cold, creeping in from every direction. The man's presence felt heavier now, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't focus. Her mind raced, her heart thudding in her ears. "Who are you?" Sarah finally demanded, her voice trembling. She turned to him, eyes wide. The man didn't respond at first, and the air grew still, thick with tension. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "I told you. I'm going wherever you're going." His voice was hollow now, the words echoing strangely in the confined space of the car. Sarah's blood ran cold. She wasn't sure why, but she knew this wasn't right. Her instincts screamed at her to pull over, to get out of the car. But something held her in place, something that felt like an invisible force. The headlights flickered again, this time more violently. The man's reflection in the rearview mirror twisted, his face distorting, his features melting into a grotesque smile that was nothing short of horrific. The eyes in the mirror, black, empty, and bottomless, stared back at her. "Stop the car," the man said suddenly, his voice now a whisper of despair. "Stop the car, Sarah." Before she could react, the car's engine roared to life on its own, speeding up as if guided by some unseen hand. The man, now completely distorted, leaned toward her, his cold breath brushing against her ear. "Stop, stop, or I'll never let you go." The road stretched out endlessly before her, but in the reflection of the mirror, Sarah could see it, an endless line of dark, shadowy figures standing on either side of the road. Figures she hadn't seen before, figures that didn't belong in the world of the living. Her grip tightened on the wheel. The fear bubbling up in her chest reached its peak, and without thinking, She slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. When Sarah finally dared to look at the passenger seat again, the man was gone. The seat beside her was empty. The air had returned to normal, the chill lifting as if it had never been there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around. But there was nothing. Nothing but the open road ahead. She drove home in silence, but as she pulled into her driveway and shut off the engine, she glanced at her rear-view mirror one last time. The man's reflection stared back at her, and then a whisper, barely audible but chilling nonetheless. "I'm still with you." The mirror's reflection. Oliver Grant had always been drawn to antiques. There was something about the history they carried with them, the stories they could tell if only they could speak. He wasn't superstitious. He'd never been the type to believe in ghosts or curses. So when he inherited a Victorian mirror from his late grandmother, he didn't give it a second thought. It was a beautiful piece, with an ornate, gilded frame that had been carefully preserved for over a century. A perfect addition to his apartment, he thought. The first few days with the mirror were uneventful. It hung in the hallway, reflecting the dim light of his apartment's lamps. Oliver admired its craftsmanship, marveling at the intricate carvings that decorated its frame. But as the days went on, something began to feel off. It wasn't the mirror itself. It was the way it reflected the world around him. Or rather, how it didn't. At first, it was subtle. He would catch a glimpse of the reflection out of the corner of his eye and think it looked slightly different, almost as if the objects in the reflection weren't aligned with the real world. But when he turned to get a better look, everything would appear normal again. He chalked it up to fatigue, perhaps from the long work hours that had been draining him lately. But then things started happening more frequently. One evening, after a long day at work, Oliver stood in front of the mirror to adjust his tie. As he looked at his reflection, he noticed something peculiar, a shadow moving in the corner of the frame. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but when he looked closer, his heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, there was someone standing just behind him. A figure, tall, thin, with long, dark hair. The figure's face was obscured in shadow, but it was unmistakably there, standing just a few inches behind him. Oliver whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. But the hallway was empty. He turned back to the mirror, but the reflection was gone. He stared at his own face, feeling his pulse race. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. He wasn't sure if he was imagining things, or if there was something truly sinister about the mirror. Days passed, and the oddities continued. The reflections in the mirror began to change, slowly at first, but with growing intensity. One evening, Oliver was brushing his teeth, and as he looked up at the mirror, his reflection wasn't quite right. His face was distorted, his features slightly elongated, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They looked hollow, sunken in. He blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly finished brushing his teeth and left the bathroom, trying to push the unsettling thought from his mind. But it wasn't just his face. One morning he was getting dressed when he noticed that the reflection in the mirror showed him wearing an entirely different outfit. He was dressed in a black suit, something he'd never worn before, and standing in a completely different room. It wasn't his apartment. The walls were dark, covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and decrepit. The reflection showed him staring at something, a door. But when he turned to look behind him, there was no door in his apartment. Frozen, he stared at the reflection. His reflection was slowly turning towards the door in the mirror, moving with an unnatural slowness, as if it was waiting for something. Then, the door creaked open in the reflection, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. Oliver's heart raced, and he quickly turned away from the mirror, his hands shaking. His apartment felt too small, too quiet, as if the walls were closing in on him. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time Oliver closed his eyes, he saw the dark room from the reflection, the door creaking open, and the cold, empty void beyond it. His mind raced with questions. What was happening? Was the mirror cursed? Or was it something else, something more terrifying than he could understand? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Oliver decided to examine the mirror more closely. He took a flashlight and shined it along the edges, searching for any clue as to why it was behaving so strangely. That's when he noticed it, a small, almost imperceptible engraving along the frame. It was faint, as if it had been worn away over time, but he could just make it out. The soul that gazes into this glass shall be claimed by it. A chill ran down his spine. He stared at the engraving, disbelief flooding his mind. It was a curse. But how had his grandmother come to possess such a thing? Why had no one ever mentioned it before? That night, the mirror seemed to come alive. The reflection showed Oliver in the same room, but his reflection was now smiling, a grotesque, twisted smile that stretched unnaturally wide across his face. It was as if the reflection was mocking him, enjoying his growing terror. The reflection reached out, and as its hand pressed against the glass, Oliver felt an icy coldness creeping up his own arm. Terrified, Oliver turned away from the mirror. He ran into the hallway, only to hear something behind him, a faint whisper. He spun around, his eyes wide with fear. "You cannot escape. The mirror has claimed you." That night, Oliver did not sleep. He stayed awake, watching the reflection in the mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. It had become something else, something alive, and it wanted him. As dawn approached, Oliver knew what he had to do. With trembling hands, he took the mirror down from the wall. He could feel the weight of it, the oppressive energy pressing against him as if the mirror didn't want to be moved. But he had no choice. He dragged it outside, and with one final glance at the cursed reflection, he smashed it to the ground. The sound of glass, shattering, echoed through the empty streets. But even as he stood there, breathing heavily, he could still hear the whispers, soft, distant, and somehow inside his head. And the reflection. It was gone, replaced by the empty pieces of broken glass. Or was it? As Oliver turned to walk back to his apartment, he felt a strange, nagging sensation. He glanced at his hand, and for a brief moment he could have sworn he saw something, a dark shadow, moving just beneath his skin. He froze. The reflection had never left. The Calling. Jason Harris had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Growing up, he'd read horror stories, watched eerie movies, and listened to friends tell ghost tales around campfires. But in the back of his mind, he always dismissed them. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. Voices in the dark, flickering lights, strange coincidences. Everything could be explained away with science, reason, and good old-fashioned skepticism. That was until he moved into the old house on Elm Street. The house had been empty for years, the yard overgrown, the window dark. Jason had inherited it from a distant relative, a great aunt he hardly remembered. He wasn't sure why she left him the house, but the thought of having a place of his own, away from the hustle of city life, appealed to him. He could fix it up, make it his own. But the house had a history, one Jason would soon learn had been buried deep in the past. From the moment Jason stepped inside, he felt a strange pull. The air was thick, almost stale, as though the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for him to arrive. The floors creaked underfoot. The walls seemed to whisper faintly when the wind blew. But Jason was too practical to believe in such things. He shrugged it off as the old house settling, a few minor quirks of age and neglect. It wasn't until the third night that things began to get strange. He was lying in bed, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room, when he heard it. A soft, melodic sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too consistent. It was a song, faint but clear, coming from somewhere deep within the house. Jason sat up, his heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement, echoing through the walls, almost as if someone was playing a piano. But there was no piano in the house. No one was downstairs. He was alone. Curious and uneasy, he got out of bed and crept downstairs. The air grew colder as he descended into the basement, the eerie music growing louder with each step. The basement door was ajar, the dim light from the hallway casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Jason stepped inside, his breath visible in the freezing air. The basement was empty, except for old boxes, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and stacks of forgotten belongings. But the music, it was coming from the far corner. And there, sitting in the darkness, was an old piano. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He had never noticed the piano before. How had it gotten there? It looked ancient, covered in dust, its ivory keys yellowed with age. But someone was playing it. The music stopped abruptly as Jason stepped closer. The room fell silent, the oppressive quiet filling his ears. He reached out for the piano, his fingers brushing the cold surface. But as soon as he touched it, the room grew colder still. A chill ran down his spine, and he could feel it. A presence, watching him. Suddenly the piano keys began to play on their own, a haunting melody that sent shivers through his body. The air thickened, and Jason could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, reached his ears. "It's time to listen, Jason." The voice was soft, feminine, and ancient. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, surrounding him, suffocating him. Jason stumbled backward, his legs shaking as the piano played louder, faster, the notes spiraling out of control. The air became thick with tension, and Jason could feel something pressing against his chest, as if the very walls of the basement were closing in on him. The whispering came again, this time louder, more urgent. "You've heard the call. It's time to answer." Jason's mind raced. He needed to get out of there. This wasn't just an old house. It was something else. Something that wanted him, that had been waiting for him. He turned and bolted up the stairs, the sound of the piano still echoing in his ears. The door to the basement slammed shut behind him, and he locked it, his breath coming in short gasps. But even as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house had just begun to awaken. The music, the whispers, they weren't random. They were a message, a call. The next few days were a blur. Jason couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Everywhere he went, he felt the pull of the house like a weight pressing down on him. He would hear the piano in the back of his mind, the faintest echo of the haunting melody that had called him. One afternoon, after a sleepless night, Jason decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to leave the house, get as far away from it as possible. He packed his things, locked the doors, and drove out, the house growing smaller in his rearview mirror. But even as he drove away, he felt it. The call. It was there, in the back of his mind, pulling him back. It wasn't over. Weeks later, Jason returned to the house, unable to resist the pull any longer. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that he had to go back. The house was waiting for him, and the call was stronger now. When he walked inside, everything was just as it had been before. The air felt thick with anticipation, the house standing silent, as if it had been holding its breath. He didn't go to the basement this time. Instead, he walked to the grand staircase, his steps echoing through the empty halls. At the top of the stairs, he saw it. The door to the room he hadn't dared open before. The room that had always been locked. The door was slightly ajar. With trembling hands, Jason pushed it open. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the moonlight revealed a figure sitting in a chair in the center of the room. The figure was hunched over, its back to him. The hair was long, dark, and tangled, but the figure was still. As Jason stepped closer, the figure turned, its eyes locking onto his. It was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her face was twisted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull him in, deeper and deeper. "You've answered the call," she whispered, her voice raspy, as if it had been lost in time. Jason stepped back, fear flooding his veins. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls tightening, the air growing thick and suffocating. The woman stood, her movements jerky and unnatural. She reached out toward him, her hands cold and stiff. "You can never leave," she murmured. "You belong to the house now." Jason screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The light in the woods. Chloe Miller had always been drawn to the woods. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forest, she spent countless hours exploring the trails, the creek, and the dense thicket of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The woods were her sanctuary, her place of peace. But there was something different about the woods that night. It had been a year since her last visit. Chloe had been away for college, but now she was home for the weekend, looking to relive some childhood memories and take a walk in the woods to clear her head. The air was crisp, the scent of pine fresh, and the sky was clear with a full moon overhead. It was the perfect evening for a hike. She parked her car at the trailhead and began her walk. The familiar sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig, were comforting as she made her way deeper into the woods. The path was narrow but well-worn, and as she walked, she let her thoughts drift. But then she saw it. At first, it was just a small flicker in the distance, like a distant star. But as Chloe walked closer, the light grew brighter. It was a soft, glowing light, hovering just above the ground between the trees. It wasn't the harsh light of a flashlight or a lantern. It was an ethereal, almost gentle glow, like moonlight reflecting off a surface, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Curiosity got the better of her, and Chloe followed the light. She had been down this trail countless times, and had never seen anything like this. It wasn't normal. Nothing about it made sense. But something about the glow seemed inviting. It felt warm, like the forest was calling her. The light led her deeper into the woods, further away from the familiar trail. Chloe's footsteps quickened as the glow grew more intense. It was almost hypnotic now, drawing her forward with an inexplicable force. As she approached the source of the light, she found herself standing in a small clearing. The glow was coming from the base of a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting into the night sky. At the foot of the tree was a small, glowing orb, no larger than a softball, floating just above the ground. It flickered like a flame but moved like a wisp of smoke, undulating gently in the air. Chloe reached out, her hand trembling slightly. She wasn't sure why, but the orb felt like it was calling to her, like it had a message it wanted to share. She hovered her hand just above it, sensing the warmth that radiated from its soft glow. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The orb pulsed once, then shot up into the air, disappearing into the dark canopy above. Chloe stumbled back, her heart racing. She hadn't expected it to move. She thought it would stay there, waiting for her to reach out and touch it. Before she could gather her thoughts, the forest around her grew still. The sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, had ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned in a slow circle, trying to get her bearings. That was when she saw them. Figures. They appeared from the shadows, stepping out from behind trees, emerging from the darkness like they had been waiting for her. There were at least a dozen of them, tall, thin, and cloaked in dark, tattered robes that blended into the night. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but Chloe could feel their eyes on her, watching her, waiting. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Chloe's breath caught in her throat as it raised a hand, a long, bony finger pointing directly at her. The figure's voice was low, rasping, and ancient, echoing in her mind as if it were speaking directly into her thoughts. "You should not have come." Chloe's heart raced as she took a step back. Panic surged through her, and she turned to run, but the figures closed in, surrounding her in a silent circle. The trees seemed to close in around her, the moonlight blocked by the thick canopy overhead. "You have awakened something that should not be disturbed," the figure continued, its voice growing colder. "The forest is not what it seems." Chloe's mind raced. She needed to escape. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let them take her. But no matter how hard she tried to move, her legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the ground itself was holding her in place, roots twisting around her ankles, keeping her rooted to the spot. The figures moved closer, their presence suffocating. The air grew colder, and Chloe could feel the oppressive weight of their gaze. She fought against the invisible force that kept her in place, but it was no use. The forest had claimed her. Then, without warning, the orb reappeared. It floated down from the trees, hovering just above the clearing, casting its soft, ethereal glow once again. It moved closer to Chloe, and this time, it didn't hesitate. It reached out, not physically but through the air, drawing Chloe's attention, pulling her toward it. "You will join us," the figure whispered, its voice a fading echo in her mind. "You will never leave." The orb expanded, its glow enveloping Chloe. She felt a warmth flood through her, a sense of peace that was so foreign, so unnatural, that it took her breath away. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole, and there was no escape. Chloe's vision blurred. The last thing she saw before everything faded into white was the hooded figure smiling, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowing with a deep, knowing light. The next morning, the forest was silent once again. The trail was empty, and no trace of Chloe could be found. But if you listen closely enough, on certain nights, when the air is still and the moon is full, you might hear it, the faintest sound, like a whisper in an. The trees A call that never ends. The Forgotten Village. Max Sullivan had always been the type to seek out adventure. As a travel blogger, he was constantly on the move, exploring hidden gems and venturing off the beaten path to uncover the secrets of the world. One afternoon, while sifting through maps and old folklore books, Max stumbled upon a reference to a village hidden deep in the mountains, a place that had been abandoned for over a century. The village had no name on modern maps and was shrouded in mystery. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it had been forgotten by time itself. Intrigued by the stories, Max decided to find it. The adventure, the mystery, the idea of uncovering something lost to history, all of it pulled him in like a magnet. He packed his gear, grabbed his camera, and set off toward the mountains, excited by the prospect of discovering the unknown. The journey was difficult, the roads were narrow and winding, and the weather unpredictable. But after 2 days of trekking through dense forests and craggy hills, Max finally reached the clearing where the village was said to lie. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. Max's heart raced with excitement. He could see the outline of old stone buildings in the distance, barely visible through the mist that had begun to settle in. He approached the village cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the ground. The buildings were old, crumbling, their walls covered in vines and moss. There were no signs of life, no people, no animals, nothing that suggested this place had ever been inhabited. It was as though the village had been swallowed by time itself. Max explored the village, taking pictures of the decaying houses and overgrown streets. The silence was oppressive, but he didn't mind. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, as if he had stepped into another time. But as he wandered further, he began to notice something strange. The houses were arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward. At the center of the village stood a large stone structure, its purpose unclear, perhaps a temple or a meeting hall. The structure was larger than the others, its stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Max's curiosity deepened. He moved closer to the stone building, feeling an odd pull toward it. As he entered the structure, he found that the walls were lined with faded carvings, symbols that he couldn't decipher. The air inside was thick, cold, and heavy, with the scent of old wood and stone. In the center of the room was an altar, and on the altar there was something that caught his eye, a small, intricately carved box, barely visible under a layer of dust. Without thinking, Max reached for the box. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a low, almost inaudible hum filled the air. He pulled his hand back quickly, startled, but the hum continued, growing louder. The walls seemed to vibrate, and Max's heart began to ray. He was about to put the box down when the sound abruptly stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now, tense, thick with anticipation. Max didn't know what came over him, but he couldn't resist. He opened the box. Inside was a small, weathered piece of paper, folded neatly. He unfolded it, his hands trembling as he read the words, scrawled in faded ink. "They will find you. You cannot leave." Max's blood ran cold. The village felt different now, as if something had been awakened. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but a part of him was still intrigued. The paper seemed too old to be a modern prank, and the message itself sent a chill through him. He couldn't just walk away without understanding what had happened here. Suddenly the air grew colder, and the ground beneath Max's feet seemed to shift. The village, which had appeared abandoned, was now teeming with an unsettling energy. The wind picked up, howling through the streets, carrying with it whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Max rushed back outside, his mind racing. But when he reached the village square, he froze. The village wasn't empty anymore. Figures moved in the shadows, dark, indistinct shapes, their forms blending with the mist. They didn't walk like people. They glided, their movements fluid, unnatural. Max felt his throat tighten as he realized that they were coming closer. A voice broke through the wind, a voice that didn't belong to any human. It was ancient, almost like a chant, and it echoed through the village, reverberating in his mind. "You are here. You will stay." Max turned, his heart pounding, and ran. He didn't look back, but he could hear them, feel them following him. The mist seemed to thicken, swallowing the path ahead. His breath came in sharp gasps as he ran toward the edge of the village, but no matter how fast he ran, the figures stayed just behind him. The trees closed in around him, their branches twisting and reaching out like hands, as if trying to keep him trapped. He finally stumbled upon the edge of the village, but the path he had taken to arrive here was gone. The woods had swallowed it whole. There was no way out. In a panic, Max grabbed his phone and tried to call for help. But the screen was blank. No signal, no connection. He was alone and there was no escape. As the figures closed in on him, their forms becoming more distinct, pale, hollow faces with empty eyes, Max felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers grew louder, and he could hear the words clearly now. "You are ours now." The ground beneath him gave way, and he fell, plunging into darkness. The staring eyes. Leo Patterson had always been fascinated by the unknown. Growing up, he devoured books on mysteries, conspiracies, and the paranormal. He loved to explore abandoned places, to seek out the forgotten corners of the world where most people never ventured. So when he stumbled upon an old mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that had been abandoned for decades, Leo couldn't resist. The rumors about the house were endless. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it had once been the site of strange experiments. No one knew for sure, but the mystery of it called to him, and Leo was determined to uncover its secrets. The house was as decrepit as the stories had promised. Crumbling walls, broken windows, and a gate so rusted it barely creaked open when Leo pushed it. But despite its dilapidated condition, there was something imposing about the house, something that made Leo's skin prickle with anticipation. The mansion stood tall and silent, as though it were waiting for him to enter. With his camera in hand and a flashlight in the other, Leo stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He moved cautiously through the house, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The walls were lined with faded portraits of long-gone families, their eyes seeming to follow his every movement. Leo shrugged it off, adjusting his camera, and continued on, determined to explore every inch of the place. As he ventured deeper into the house, the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the oppressive silence, it was something more. There was a sense of being watched, of eyes lurking in the corners of the room, hidden just out of sight. Leo shook off the unease and pressed on, but the feeling of being observed only intensified. Then he found it. At the end of a long hallway, there was a door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to peek inside. Leo approached it cautiously. His curiosity piqued. When he pushed the door open, a chill ran down his spine. The room was dimly lit, its only source of light coming from a single dusty window. But it wasn't the room itself that caught his attention. It was the painting. The painting was large, dominating the far wall. It depicted a family, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing in front of a dark, brooding house. The faces of the figures were gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. But what made Leo's heart race was the way the eyes seemed to follow him, not just in the painting, but in the room itself. The figures' eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were staring directly at him. Leo took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. It was as though the figures were aware of his presence, their gaze locked on him, unblinking. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his chest as he stared back at the painting, unable to look away. Suddenly the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the light from the window flickered. Leo's heart began to pound as the figures in the painting began to move, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then with growing urgency. Their eyes widened, and their lips curled into twisted smiles. The painting was coming to life. In a panic, Leo turned to leave, but as he stepped back into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind him. He whirled around, his hand reaching for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed and pulled, but the door was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. "You should never have come here." The voice was soft at first, a whisper in the air, but it grew louder with each passing second. Leo spun around, his flashlight scanning the dark hallway, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't coming from any one place. It seemed to echo in his mind, as though the house itself was speaking to him. "Leave now, or you will stay forever." Leo's pulse quickened. He couldn't explain it, but something about the house was alive, and it was angry. The walls seemed to close in on him, the portrait's eyes following his every move, and the temperature dropped, a bone-chilling cold seeping into his skin. He reached for his phone, but when he checked the screen, the words on it made his stomach turn. No signal, no escape. A sudden gust of wind swept through the hallway, blowing out his flashlight. The room fell into darkness. Leo stumbled backward, his heart racing. But before he could take another step, he felt it. Cold fingers brushing against his arm. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all speaking at once. "You are ours. You will never leave." Panic surged through Leo's chest as he backed away, but the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in with every step. The eyes from the paintings, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were everywhere now, in the dark, watching him. He could feel their gaze seeping into his mind, pulling him deeper into the madness of the house. With a final burst of adrenaline, Leo pushed forward, charging toward the front door. But as he reached it, he stopped dead in his tracks. The door was gone. The house had swallowed it whole. Behind him, the figures from the paintings were there, standing in the hallway, their faces twisted in grotesque grins. Their hollow eyes stared directly at him, their mouths opening, but no sound came out. "Stay with us." Leo couldn't take it anymore. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the now endless hallways. But the house was shifting, bending, trapping him inside. The figures followed, their eyes never leaving him. The last thing Leo saw before the darkness took him was the painting. The figures in the frame were no longer just staring. They were moving toward him, reaching out with skeletal hands, their grins widening as they closed in. The cold room. Sarah Carter had always loved old houses, the ones with stories to tell, the ones full of hidden corners and forgotten histories. When she found an affordable apartment in a converted Victorian building, she jumped at the opportunity. The place was charming, with tall windows, intricate woodwork, and original hardwood floors. It felt like the kind of place that could wrap you in a warm embrace, until she moved in. The first few nights were fine. Sarah spent her evenings unpacking, organizing, and exploring the small neighborhood. It wasn't until the fourth night that things began to feel off. It started with the temperature. At first, it was subtle. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night, shivering despite the warmth of her blankets. She thought the heating system was faulty, so she turned it up, only to find the chill lingering in the air. By the next evening, the temperature in her apartment had dropped significantly. The living room felt cold, and the warmth from the radiators seemed to have no effect. She shrugged it off, figuring the building was just old. Maybe the pipes were in need of repair, or the insulation wasn't what it used to be. But when she woke up the following night, her breath was visible in the air. She could see the condensation forming in front of her face as she pulled the covers tighter around her. There was something about the coldness that felt unnatural. The apartment had always been drafty, but this was different. The chill seemed to come from nowhere, seeping into her bones like something alive. Her thoughts turned to the building's history. The Victorian era was full of strange tales, and as she pulled on a sweater, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the darkness. The next day, Sarah decided to investigate. She explored the apartment more thoroughly than she had before, checking for any leaks or drafty areas. But as she passed the hallway leading to her bedroom, she noticed something strange. At the far end of the hall, behind a door she rarely opened, was a small room. The door was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness showing through. It wasn't on the apartment's original floor plan, and she couldn't remember ever seeing it before. Curiosity got the best of her. She approached the door slowly, the air growing colder the closer she got. It was as though the room beyond was exhaling frost into the hallway. She pushed the door open. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a chair, and it was freezing cold. Sarah could see her breath in the air, and the temperature was noticeably lower than the rest of the apartment. There was nothing in the room, no furniture, no light fixtures, nothing except a thin layer of dust on the floor. But the walls were lined with strange, faded markings. Sarah squatted down to examine them. They looked like scratches, long and deliberate, carved into the wood. Some were shallow, barely visible, while others were deep, as though something had raked its nails across the surface for years. Her pulse quickened. She stood up, her feet cold against the floor, and took a step back toward the door. But that was when she heard it. A faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the far corner of the room. "Get out!" Sarah's heart stopped. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there. No one in the room. No one in the hallway. The air was thick with silence. The whisper had been clear, and it had come from the room itself. She backed out of the room quickly, the cold seeping deeper into her skin. As she shut the door behind her, she felt a sudden pressure in her chest, a weight she couldn't explain. That night, the temperature dropped even further. The entire apartment felt like a frozen tomb. Sarah wrapped herself in blankets, trying to ignore the chill that had settled into her bones. But then, as the clock struck midnight, she heard something again. Footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps coming from the hallway outside her room. Her heart raced as she lay still, her breath shallow. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to her door. She held her breath, afraid to move, to make a sound. The footsteps stopped, and then, The door to her bedroom slowly creaked open. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. There was no way it was the wind. This was different. The door wasn't opening on its own, not from the force of a draft or the house settling. Someone was opening it. Someone was standing there, in the dark, waiting. She sat up slowly, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. But there was no one there. The door was open a few inches, the room silent once more. But the cold, it was unbearable now. It pressed in on her, suffocating her. She grabbed her phone and texted a friend, asking if they could come over. She didn't care how late it was anymore. She needed someone else to be there. As she sent the message, she glanced at the door again. This time the faintest shape stood in the doorway. A figure, barely visible, standing perfectly still. "Leave!" the whisper came again, louder this time. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her keys and bolted out of bed, running toward the door. But just as she reached for the knob, the lights flickered. The room grew even colder, if that was possible, and the whispering voices grew louder, now coming from every corner of the room. "You belong here!" With shaking hands, Sarah yanked the door open and ran out of the apartment, the cold following her every step. She didn't stop until she reached the street, the air outside warm in contrast to the frost that clung to her skin. When she returned the next day with her landlord, the room was gone. The door was locked, the hallway as quiet as it had been before. The temperature in the apartment was normal, the air warm and dry. But Sarah knew the truth. The room, and whatever was, then and it hadn't gone anywhere, and one day it would come for her. The Faceless Ones. Ethan Davis had always found comfort in the ordinary. His life was simple, predictable, and perhaps a little boring. But that was just the way he liked it. He worked a 9-to-5 job at a small office, spent his weekends watching movies, and rarely ventured outside of his comfort zone. That was, until the day he received the invitation. The envelope was unusual, old-fashioned, the paper textured and slightly yellowed, with no return address. Inside, there was a single, simple note. "Join us. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Don't be late." There was no explanation, no signature, just the invitation itself. Ethan's curiosity got the better of him, and after a few days of hesitation, he decided to go. After all, it wasn't every day that someone invited him to something mysterious. It could be fun, right? He arrived at the location the next evening, a rundown building at the edge of town. The street was eerily quiet, the windows of the building dark. Despite the chilling atmosphere, Ethan felt compelled to go inside. He pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, and stepped into the dimly lit lobby. A woman stood behind a desk, her face obscured by a thick veil. She looked up as he entered, her eyes hidden beneath the fabric, and gestured for him to follow her. She led him down a narrow corridor and into a large room, where a group of people sat in a circle. Their faces were turned toward him as he entered, but something was wrong. Something was off. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. None of them had faces. It wasn't that they were wearing masks. No, their faces were simply gone. Smooth, featureless skin covered the places where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. Some of them had no skin at all. Just empty, hollow spaces where their features once were. The woman who had let him in had no face, either. Just an empty skin-covered void where her features should have been. They stared at him. Well, they didn't exactly stare, since they had no eyes. But he could feel the weight of their attention, the silent scrutiny of 1,000 unblinking gazes. The silence in the room was suffocating. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, but the woman in the veil stepped forward, blocking his path. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the silence. "You were chosen." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Chosen for what? The woman's lips parted, but instead of speaking, a low, almost melodic hum filled the room. The faceless figures around him began to sway, their bodies moving in rhythm with the sound, their faceless heads tilting as if they were listening to the same eerie tune. And then, without warning, they all began to chant. "Join us, join us." The words were rhythmic, hypnotic, and as they chanted, Ethan felt his mind begin to unravel. The room spun around him, the air thick with a cold, oppressive force. The faces, or lack thereof, of the figures seemed to blur, their empty spaces sucking him in, drawing him closer to the center of the circle. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. "What is this? Who are you?" But the chanting only grew louder, their voices melding into one. The woman in the veil stepped closer, and as she did, a strange sensation filled Ethan's chest. It was as if his own face was beginning to slip away, as though his skin was becoming smoother, featureless. "Join us." He felt his body trembling, his vision blurring. The chanting filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The world around him began to fade, and the only thing that remained was the sound of their voices, growing louder and louder. And then, just as the room seemed to consume him entirely, everything stopped. Ethan gasped for air, his chest heaving. The chanting ceased. The faceless figures were still, silent, as though they had frozen in time. He looked around, panic rising in his chest, but the woman with the veil was gone. He wasn't in the room anymore. Instead, he was standing in an empty hallway, alone. The cold, oppressive atmosphere was gone. He reached up to touch his face, and when he looked down at his hand, he saw nothing. His reflection in the dark windows around him was empty, featureless. His heart stopped. His own face was gone. Panic surged through him as he stumbled back, his hands trembling. The world seemed to tilt, and he tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth, his eyes, his nose, everything was gone. He was just like them, a faceless void. The faceless figures reappeared before him, their empty spaces staring at him with an unbearable intensity. "You are one of us now," the woman's voice whispered. But it wasn't coming from any one figure. It was coming from everywhere. Ethan's body froze as the coldness of the room seeped into his very bones. He could feel it now, the emptiness, the absence that had taken over him. He was no longer Ethan. He was one of them. And as he stood there, a part of him knew that he would never leave this place. Not as himself, not as anyone. He had joined them, and now he was faceless. End of story 16. The Faceless Ones. The Uninvited Guest. Olivia Barnes had always thought of herself as a rational person. She was an architect, a woman of logic and precision, and her world revolved around blueprints, measurements, and the steady predictability of construction. But that all changed when she bought the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for years, left to the elements, with weeds overtaking the yard and dust thickening every surface inside. But Olivia saw potential in it. She could restore the house, bring it back to life, just like the projects she worked on every day. It would be her sanctuary, a quiet place to escape from the chaos of the world. The first few weeks were spent cleaning, organizing, and assessing the damage. The foundation was solid, the structure sturdy, and with a little work, Olivia could turn the house into something magnificent. She loved the place, loved the idea of breathing new life into it. But as she worked, she began to notice strange things. It started with small things, objects out of place, doors left ajar, the faint sound of footsteps echoing when she was certain she was alone. She told herself it was nothing. Drafts, the house settling, maybe even her own forgetfulness. But the odd occurrences kept happening. One night after a long day of renovations, Olivia decided to relax and watch a movie. She settled into her couch, the soft glow of the television screen lighting up the room. But as the movie played, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, and her gaze kept drifting toward the hallway at the edge of the living room. At first, she thought it was nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. But then she saw it, a shadow. It moved just beyond her peripheral vision, flitting across the hallway. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she turned to look, but the hallway was empty. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, but when the shadow moved again, she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just a passing illusion. It was deliberate. The shadow didn't belong to any object in the room, nor did it match any of the familiar shapes in the house. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Olivia's pulse quickened. Who could it be at this hour? She stood up slowly, her body tense, and walked to the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw no one. There was no car in the driveway, no footsteps on the porch. Confused, she opened the door cautiously, but the night outside was empty. That was when she heard it, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper coming from somewhere in the house. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. It was a voice. "Olivia!" Her heart skipped a beat. She stepped back, looking around, but there was no one there. The house was silent again, too silent. Her rational mind tried to make sense of it all. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was the old wiring playing tricks, with the lights, or the house creaking in its age. But as she walked back to the living room, she felt it again. A presence, cold and suffocating, like she wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't the house that felt strange. It was her, as if she had somehow become a guest in her own home. The whisper came again, louder this time. "I'm here, Olivia." Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to face the hallway, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The only sound was her own heartbeat, thumping in her chest like a drum. The cold presence in the house intensified, wrapping around her like a thick fog. Then she saw it, standing in the doorway at the end of the hallway, a figure. It was tall, too tall, and as it stepped into the light, Olivia's blood ran cold. The figure had no face, just smooth, featureless skin, where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be. The body was outlined in the faint glow of the hallway light, but it was as if it was made of darkness itself, standing in stark contrast to the light around it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, waiting. "Why are you here?" the voice whispered again, now unmistakably coming from the figure itself. Olivia froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed, her feet glued to the floor as the figure slowly advanced, its silent footsteps echoing in the empty house. "You don't belong here." The words were chilling, dripping with a dark intent, but Olivia couldn't tear her eyes away. Every instinct told her to flee, but she couldn't. The figure stepped closer, its cold presence enveloping her. "You've taken what's not yours." Suddenly the room grew colder. The temperature dropped so drastically that Olivia could see her breath fogging in front of her. She felt the presence of the figure grow stronger, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't escape. With a surge of panic, Olivia bolted for the door, but as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. She pulled and yanked, but the door remained locked. She turned, her mind racing for an escape, but the figure was closer now, only steps away. "You can't leave. You belong here." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was commanding, echoing in her mind. Olivia's legs felt weak, her body trembling as she backed away from the figure. Her head spun and her breath grew shallow. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. And then she heard it. Footsteps, slowly, deliberately, coming closer, like the figure was closing in on her step by step. The darkness was suffocating. She felt the cold presence wrap around her, suffocating her, until she couldn't tell where the darkness ended and she began. A breath, cold and damp, brushed against her ear. "You will never leave." And then there was nothing. The shadow at the window. Tom Walker had always been skeptical of superstitions. Raised in a logical, scientific family, he believed that everything had a natural explanation. Ghosts, spirits, and strange occurrences were nothing more than tricks of the mind, illusions created by fear, stress, and the power of suggestion. So when Tom inherited his grandmother's house in the countryside, he expected it to be nothing more than a quiet, peaceful retreat, an opportunity to escape the hustle of the city for a few weeks and clear his head. The house was old, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. It was the kind of house that seemed to have a story behind every creaky floorboard and every cracked window. Tom was more than happy to take it on as a temporary escape, though he had no intention of staying forever. After all, it was just a house, nothing more. The first few days were uneventful. He spent his time cleaning out the old rooms, sorting through boxes of his grandmother's belongings, and trying to fix up the place. But as the sun began to set each evening, a strange feeling would settle over him. The air felt thicker, colder somehow, and there was an unsettling silence in the house. It was as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. One night, as he was finishing up some work in the living room, he felt it, a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The house seemed to groan in the distance, and then came a sound, faint at first, like a tapping on the window. Tom glanced over his shoulder, but the room was empty, the curtains drawn tightly shut. Probably just the wind, he thought. But the tapping came again. This time it was louder, more persistent, and closer. It wasn't the wind. Tom stood up slowly, his heart beating faster now. He approached the window, his steps cautious, and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was nothing. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Yet as he scanned the dark landscape, his eyes caught something, a shadow moving across the yard, lingering by the window. It was a figure, tall, dark, and still. Its outline was barely visible against the darkness of the night, but the longer Tom stared at it, the more he realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't standing normally. Its posture was unnaturally bent, almost as if it were crouching low to the ground. But then it straightened, slowly, and turned its head toward the window. Tom's breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, the figure's eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto his, and then it vanished into the shadows. Tom stepped back from the window, his hands shaking. His mind raced, trying to explain what he had just seen. Maybe it was an animal, or perhaps his imagination had gotten the better of him. But the feeling of being watched, the sense of something lurking just outside, lingered. He decided to leave the window, closed for the rest of the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, seemed amplified in the stillness. His mind kept returning to the figure at the window, its hollow eyes staring back at him. The next day, Tom decided to investigate. He walked around the property, checking the yard for any signs of someone, or something, that could explain what he had seen. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. He shook his head, convinced it had been a trick of the light, or a figment of his imagination. That night, however, the tapping returned. This time, it was more insistent, more frantic, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. Tom's heart pounded as he crept to the window once again, but this time he didn't peek. He yanked the curtain open, ready to face whatever was out there. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, not even the faintest movement in the yard. He stared into the darkness for several long moments, his breath catching in his throat. Had he imagined it all? Just as he began to convince himself it was all in his head, something moved. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, its form impossibly tall, its body swaying with each slow step. Tom's blood turned cold as the figure slowly, deliberately, began to approach the window. It was the same shape, the same silhouette he had seen the night before. It was coming toward him. He tried to move, tried to pull away from the window, but his body was frozen in place. He couldn't look away as the figure drew closer, its face still hidden in shadow, its steps slow and measured. The closer it got, the more its outline became defined, a dark, faceless shape that seemed to exist in the very space between the living and the dead. Then, as if in response to some unspoken command, the figure stopped just beneath the window. Its head tilted upward, and Tom felt a rush of terror like nothing he had ever experienced before. The eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the light from inside the house. But they weren't eyes at all. They were empty sockets, hollow and void of anything human. The figure reached up, its fingers long and skeletal, and began to tap on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Tom couldn't breathe. The tapping was rhythmic now, methodical, like a countdown. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was no scream, no shout, no words, just a gaping hole, an abyss of silence. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, constricted. His hand shot out to grab the door handle, but before he could open it, the figure's hand pressed against the window, its pale fingers splayed wide, blocking his escape. Tap, tap, tap. With a final desperate cry, Tom forced himself to move. He turned and ran, not daring to look back. The house seemed to stretch around him, every room, every hallway closing in as, though the walls were alive, shifting to keep him inside. But when he reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The lock was stuck, as if something had wedged itself behind it, preventing him from leaving. He heard the tapping again, only this time it was inside the house. The sound echoed through the walls, growing louder, faster, more frantic. Tap, tap, tap. And then he heard it, the voice, soft and hollow, whispering in his ear, "Let me in." The Haunted Mirror. Lily Green had always been a lover of antiques. Her apartment was filled with old furniture, vintage artwork, and quirky relics from the past, each piece telling a story, adding character to her home. So when she came across an antique mirror at a local flea market, she couldn't resist. It was beautiful, framed in tarnished silver with intricate floral patterns etched into the edges. The mirror was large, with an elegant presence that seemed to demand attention. It was exactly what her hallway needed. The seller, a frail old woman with a wrinkled face and a kind smile, warned her about the mirror. "It's been in my family for generations," the woman said softly. "But strange things have happened with it. Some say it holds memories." Lily laughed it off, dismissing it as nothing more than superstition. After all, it was just a mirror. Mirrors don't hold memories. They reflect, and nothing more. But when she brought the mirror home and hung it on the wall, strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle, faint distortions in the reflection. Lily would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the mirror, figures standing behind her that were never there when she turned around. But when she looked again, the reflection was perfectly normal. It didn't take long before the feelings of unease began to intensify. The air around the mirror seemed colder, and at night she could hear faint whispers, soft and distant, like someone was talking just beyond her hearing. Every time she glanced at the mirror, it felt like something was watching her. The reflections in it didn't seem quite right. They seemed to move independently, shifty slightly when she wasn't paying attention. Lily tried to ignore it at first, but after a week, she could no longer shake the feeling that the mirror was alive. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Lily sat down on her couch, staring at the mirror across the room. It was then that she noticed something she hadn't before. The reflection was different. In the glass, she saw herself standing perfectly still, her back turned to the room. But in the reflection, there was something behind her, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing just a few inches away. Lily's heart pounded as she jumped to her feet, spinning around, but there was nothing there. The mirror, though, was showing something else. The figure in the reflection seemed to lean closer to her, its features still a blur, but its presence unmistakable. It wasn't just any shadow. It felt wrong. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a hallucination. It was as though the mirror was pulling something out of the darkness, something that didn't belong in her home. Lily backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the mirror. She had to leave. She had to get out of that room. But as she moved, the figure in the reflection followed her, never leaving her side, its shape becoming clearer with every second. The figure reached out, its hand coming toward her in the reflection, but Lily could see no hand in the real room. She stumbled backward, her breath quickening, and the reflection in the mirror seemed to smile. "You've seen us now," the whisper came, low and chilling, and Lily's blood ran cold. "You can't leave." With a surge of terror, she ran from the room, her feet pounding the floor as she fled down the hall and out the door, the whispers echoing in her mind. For days after that, Lily couldn't shake the image of the mirror, of the figure that had been trapped inside it. She tried to forget about it, but no matter where she went, she felt its presence lurking just behind her, watching her every move. Then one night, she decided to return. She couldn't leave it like this. She had to confront whatever was in that mirror, or it would haunt her forever. When she entered the room, the mirror was still hanging on the wall, but the air felt thick, suffocating. Her eyes locked on her reflection. But this time, something was different. There was no figure behind her. There was only darkness, and in the reflection, Lily's own face seemed wrong. It was distorted, stretched unnaturally, its eyes wide with terror. As she reached out to touch the glass, the reflection smiled. A wide, malevolent grin that spread across her face, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come back," the whisper echoed, louder this time, as if coming from inside the mirror itself. "Now you're ours." Lily's hand was frozen against the glass. She tried to pull away, but something held her there, something pulling her toward the mirror, toward the darkness beyond the glass. Suddenly, her reflection began to move on its own. It twisted and contorted, its eyes bulging as it reached for her, its fingers stretching out toward her in a grotesque imitation of her own movements. The mirror cracked. The reflection's grin widened, and Lily felt her body jerk forward as though the mirror was pulling her inside, dragging her toward it. With a scream, she ripped herself free and ran from the room. But she wasn't alone anymore. In every reflective surface she passed, the windows, the glass in the hallway, the polished wood of the furniture, she could see them. The faceless figures standing just behind her, watching her. Their smiles were the same as the one in the mirror. "You are ours now," they whispered, their voices blending into one unified, suffocating chorus. Lily tried to escape, but no matter where she went, the reflections followed. She couldn't outrun them. The mirror had taken her, and now they were everywhere. And as the dark figures surrounded her, she knew she had become one of them, a part of the reflection, trapped forever in the glass. Whispers from the walls. Olivia Waters had always been excited to move into her new home. It was an old Victorian-style house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its charm enhanced by the creaky wooden floors and the ornate details in every corner. It was everything she had ever wanted, a space she could call her own, full of history and character. The kind of home where she could finally start fresh after a long period of personal struggles. The first few days were perfect. She unpacked, arranged her belongings, and basked in the peaceful solitude of the house. But it wasn't long before things began to feel strange. It started with small things, little oddities she could dismiss as her imagination. The occasional creak in the floorboards, a door that seemed to close on its own, and the faint smell of something unfamiliar that would disappear when she tried to track it down. Nothing alarming at first, but then one night, she woke to hear something that made her skin crawl, a soft whisper, as though someone was speaking just outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but when the whisper came again, this time louder, and it sounded like it was coming from within the walls, her heart began to race. "Olivia!" Her name, spoken in a breathless voice, sent a shiver down her spine. She shot up in bed, the room dark and still. The house seemed to be holding its breath. She listened intently, but there was no more sound, just the silence of the night. Was it just the wind? She tried to reason with herself, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The whispers continued every night, growing louder and more distinct. Sometimes they would call her name, and sometimes they would speak in hushed tones, too quiet for her to make out the words. At first, they seemed random, but over time, the whispers grew more purposeful, more insistent. One evening, as the whispers grew louder, Olivia couldn't take it anymore. She decided to investigate. She crept out of her bed and followed the sound, her bare feet tapping softly against the hardwood floors. The whispers led her down the narrow hallway, and she found herself standing before a door that she hadn't noticed before. The door to a small room tucked away at the end of the hall. The door was old, its paint chipped and peeling, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Olivia's hand hovered over the doorknob, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind the door now, clearer, more urgent. She turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in the center of the room was an old rocking chair, slowly swaying back and forth, though there was no breeze. The sound of creaking wood filled the space, like something or someone was there. Olivia stepped inside, her breath shallow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispers became clearer now, though the words were still indecipherable. They seemed to come from all directions, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in her mind. She walked deeper into the room, her eyes scanning the shadows. Then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, a crack ran along the wall. It was small, barely noticeable, but as she approached it, she felt a strange pull. Her hand reached for the crack, and when her fingers touched the rough edges, the whispers grew louder, as if they were coming from inside the wall itself. Before she could react, the wall suddenly shifted. The crack widened, and a hidden compartment opened, revealing something that made Olivia's blood run cold. An old, faded photograph, tattered at the edges. It showed a young girl, no older than 10, with wide, hollow eyes and a crooked smile that seemed far too unsettling for her age. Olivia's hand trembled as she picked up the photo. The whispers were now deafening, surrounding her, pressing in from every side. "Help us!" The voice was unmistakable now. It was the voice of a child, desperate and pleading. "You can hear us, can't you?" In a panic, Olivia stumbled back, dropping the photo to the floor. Her heart raced as she backed away from the wall, but as she turned to leave the room, she froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a small girl, no more than 10, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were the same as the ones in the photograph, dark, hollow, and filled with a deep sorrow that seemed to pierce right through Olivia's soul. The girl didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on Olivia, as if waiting for her to do something, to understand. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, and the girl's form flickered, as though she were fading in and out of existence. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that was both oppressive and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all pleading with Olivia to help them. Suddenly the girl's voice cut through the cacophony, sharp and clear. "You must leave this house, or they will take you too." Terrified, Olivia bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran down the hallway, back to her bedroom, and slammed the door shut behind her. She collapsed onto her bed, gasping for breath. The room fell silent. The whispers stopped. For the first time since she had moved in, Olivia felt the weight of the house lift. The oppressive air was gone. The presence she had felt, gone. But even as she lay there, her mind racing with questions and fears, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not truly alone, that something in the walls was watching, waiting. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly dawn. And then, as if on cue, the whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder, coming from the walls. "Olivia!" The house was not finished with her yet. The vanishing roommate. Max Jennings was thrilled to have found a new apartment in the city. It was cheap, clean, and located in a quiet part of town, a perfect escape from the chaos of his college life. But what really sealed the deal for him was the roommate, Ryan, quiet, polite, and seemingly normal. They hit it off immediately during their first meeting, and Max felt like he had found a place to call home. The first few weeks went by without a hitch. They kept to themselves, living their separate lives, with only the occasional conversation in the kitchen or bathroom. Max had never been one for big social gatherings, and Ryan seemed content with that, too. But then, things began to feel off. Max started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Ryan, who had always been polite and friendly, started to act a little strange. He became distant, often locking himself in his room for hours. When he did come out, his eyes looked hollow, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed perpetually tired, though Max never saw him sleep. The oddest part was that Max had never heard Ryan leave the apartment. The door was always locked when Max came home, and Ryan's car was always parked in its spot. Max didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Ryan was going through something. Maybe he just needed his space. But then one night, things escalated. It was a Friday, and Max had stayed up late studying for an exam. He was in his room when he heard something, a soft scraping sound, followed by a strange, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside his door. Max froze, his heart racing. He had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't like the usual creaks of the old building. This was something deliberate, almost unnatural. He got up, cautiously opened his door, and peered out into the dimly lit hallway. The source of the sound was immediately apparent. Ryan was standing there, staring at the wall, his fingers tapping against it in an odd pattern. "Ryan?" Max called softly. Ryan didn't respond. "Ryan, what are you doing?" Still, no answer. Ryan's head tilted slightly, his face expressionless, his eyes blank. It was as if he hadn't heard Max at all. Max stepped closer, a sense of dread crawling up his spine. He placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, but the touch made Ryan flinch, as if waking from a trance. Ryan's eyes blinked rapidly, and he looked around as if he had no idea where he was. "Max?" Ryan finally said, his voice weak and distant. What time is it?" Max's stomach twisted. The entire interaction felt wrong, unnerving. "It's almost midnight. Are you okay?" Ryan blinked again, slowly, before offering a strained smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. I'll go to bed now." Max nodded, though his unease didn't fade. Ryan didn't wait for another word. He simply turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him. The next day, Ryan was gone. Max woke up to find the apartment eerily quiet. Ryan's room, which had usually been locked, was wide open. Max hesitated, unsure whether he should check on him. But when he walked past the door, something caught his attention. A small piece of paper on the floor, partially hidden beneath the doorframe. Max picked it up. On it, in Ryan's shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't trust me." A chill ran down Max's spine as he stood there, staring at the paper. What the hell was going on? He knocked on Ryan's door, but when there was no response, he opened it cautiously. The room was completely empty. No bed, no clothes, not even a trace that anyone had ever lived there. The closet was bare, and the drawers were open but empty. The only thing left behind was the faint smell of something metallic, something stale. Max felt his heart race. He ran to the front door only to find it locked. He fumbled with the keys, opened the door, and stepped out into the hallway. There, in the hallway mirror, he caught a glimpse of Ryan. Except this time, something was wrong. Ryan's reflection wasn't quite right. It was like he was staring at the wrong part of the room, his eyes fixed on nothing. Max whipped around, but Ryan was nowhere in sight. "Ryan!" Max shouted, his voice echoing through the empty apartment. But there was no answer. The apartment was silent once more. Max's hands shook as he closed the door and locked it. The walls seemed to close in on him. The feeling of unease was overwhelming. He checked his phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls from Ryan. He scrolled through his contacts. Nothing. The next day, Max returned home after class to find that Ryan's car was parked in the driveway again. Max's pulse quickened as he approached the apartment, but when he opened the door, he was met with an unsettling silence. The place was exactly as it had been the day before. Nothing had changed, except Ryan wasn't there. Max sat down on the couch, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was somewhere, watching him, lurking just out of sight. Maybe he was just going crazy, or maybe something had happened to Ryan, something that Max couldn't understand. A few days later, Max's fears were confirmed. As he was leaving for class, he noticed something strange on the floor near the door. A small handwritten note, tucked under a stack of mail. It was from Ryan. "You should have never moved in. They'll come for you next." Max froze, his hand still on the doorknob. His mind raced, and panic set in. He looked around the apartment as if expecting Ryan to appear at any moment, but it was just him, alone. He couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening to Ryan, it was happening to him too. He grabbed his things and left the apartment, not daring to look back. The last time Max saw Ryan, he was standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. Now, it seemed, Ryan was gone, vanished, and Max had no idea whether he'd be the next one to disappear. The last call. Megan Foster was used to the late-night shifts at the hospital. Working as a nurse on the graveyard shift had its perks: less traffic, more downtime. But it also came with its own set of challenges. Most people were asleep, and the world outside was silent. But within the hospital's walls, it was never truly quiet. The beeping of machines, the murmurs of staff, the occasional cry of a patient, all of it formed the backdrop of her late-night world. One particularly quiet night, Megan was finishing up some paperwork in the nurse's station when the phone rang. It wasn't unusual for the phone to ring at odd hours, but the chill that ran down her spine when she picked it up was something new. She answered the phone as she always did. "Emergency room, Megan Foster speaking. How can I help you?" There was a long pause on the other end, and Megan glanced at the phone, wondering if there was a malfunction. But then, a voice came through, thin, raspy, and weak. "Help me! I'm scared." The voice was faint, as though coming from a great distance, but the words were clear enough. Megan's stomach twisted with a strange sense of unease. It sounded like the voice of an elderly person, but the tone, it was strained, desperate. "Who is this?" Megan asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Help me! I can't breathe! Please!" The voice stopped abruptly, replaced by a harsh, coughing fit. Megan's fingers tightened around the phone, her pulse quickening. Was this a prank call? No, it didn't sound like one. It sounded like someone who was truly in distress. "Where are you?" Megan asked, her voice sharper now. "Tell me where you are. I'll send help." There was another long silence before the voice returned, whispering. "Room 213, please." The line went dead. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the receiver in disbelief. Room 213? That room hadn't been occupied for weeks. In fact, it was supposed to be empty, waiting for new patients. She couldn't understand why someone would call from there, or why they sounded so desperate, so real. She stood up quickly, instinctively moving toward the hallway. A sense of dread had settled over her, but she couldn't ignore the voice. She had to check it out. The hospital was eerily quiet as Megan walked down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she passed the nurse's station, she glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. The halls were dark, with only the dim emergency lights casting faint shadows against the walls. When she reached room 213, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the room beyond dark. She could hear nothing, no beeping machines, no rustling sheets. But she felt a nagging pull, an unexplainable urgency to open the door. With a deep breath, Megan pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was completely still and at bay. First, she saw nothing unusual. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly tucked in. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small flickering light on the bedside table, a lamp that seemed to have been recently turned on. "Megan?" The voice echoed from the corner of the room, and Megan's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes widening in disbelief. Sitting in the corner of the room, in a chair that hadn't been there earlier, was a woman, pale, gaunt, and frail. Her face was obscured by matted hair, and her body was hunched over in a way that didn't look quite right. She looked at Megan with hollow eyes, eyes that seemed to stare through her, not at her. I need help," the woman whispered, her voice dry and cracked. They won't let me go." Megan's heart raced. She had no idea who this woman was. There had been no patient in room 213 recently, let alone someone who looked so sick. But the way the woman spoke, the desperation in her tone, sent a wave of unease over Megan. I'm going to get you some help," Megan stammered, but the woman's gaze never wavered. "No," the woman croaked. "They won't let you help me." Megan's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. But everything seemed normal, except for the woman in the chair, and the voice on the phone, the voice that had told her to come here. Megan took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lips twisted into a faint smile, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "I'm the one who never left. I called you. I called because I need to warn you." Before Megan could respond, the woman suddenly stood up, her body jerking unnaturally. Her limbs twisted, and she let out a horrible, guttural scream, one that made Megan's blood freeze. The woman lurched toward her, her hands reaching out as if to grab her, her mouth open in a soundless scream. Megan stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the floor. Her head slammed into the edge of the bed, and the room spun around her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the woman's voice, now clearer than ever. "Don't answer the phone. It's never really me." The house at the edge of town. David Roberts had always been drawn to the quiet, secluded corners of the world. So when he moved to the small rural town of Harrowbrook, he felt at home. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the pace of life was slow, easy. He quickly found a small house on the outskirts of town, cheap, with a beautiful view of the fields that stretched for miles. It seemed like the perfect place to escape, to reset. The house was old, a bit run down, but it had charm. There were rumors in town about the house, strange ones, about its past occupants. People had died there, or so the town's older residents said. But David was skeptical of local superstitions, and besides, the rent was affordable. He didn't mind the creaky floors or the drafty windows. He didn't even mind the strange chill that seemed to linger in the air, especially at night. It was a house, after all. a place to sleep. Nothing more. At first, the house felt just like any other. David spent his days unpacking and organizing, and his nights reading or watching TV. But soon enough, things started to change. Small things. Nothing that would make anyone else think twice. There were noises at night, whispers, faint but distinct, coming from the walls. Sometimes the sound of footsteps would echo through the empty halls when no one was there. David shrugged it off. The house was old. Houses made noises. But the whispers grew louder as time went on. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or the house settling. But when he started hearing his name being called, softly, almost as if it were a whisper in his ear, he couldn't ignore it anymore. David. It happened one evening as he was sitting in the living room reading a book. He heard it clearly, the whisper of his name, faint but unmistakable. He looked up, his heart racing, but the room was empty. The windows were shut, and the front door was locked. No one else could be there. David, the whisper came again, this time from the direction of the hallway. He stood up, his skin crawling. It wasn't just a whisper. It was like the house was calling to him, beckoning him toward something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. But curiosity got the better of him, and he slowly made his way toward the hallway. The lights flickered above him, casting long shadows along the walls. He stepped cautiously, his footsteps muffled on the old carpet, until he reached the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. He paused, listening. The whispering had stopped, but there was a new sound now. Soft, faint scratching, like nails on wood. David swallowed hard and pushed the bedroom door open, his breath caught in his throat. The room was empty, but the scratching sound persisted, coming from the far corner of the room, where an old wooden dresser stood. The air in the room felt heavier now, colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He walked closer, cautiously, and reached out to open the dresser drawers. As he touched the handle, the scratching stopped. But the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, as though something was watching him. Without thinking, David pulled open the drawer. The moment he did, a blast of cold air hit him, and the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Inside the drawer was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words scrawled in faded ink. "Leave while you can. It's not what it seems. Don't open the door. Don't." The air around him seemed to thicken, the oppressive silence almost deafening. David felt an icy chill run down his spine. He could feel something now, something watching him. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing there. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Someone, or something, was approaching. David turned quickly, but there was no one there. The house was silent again. That was when he heard it, the sound of the door creaking open. He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. At the end of the hallway, the door to the basement, the one he had never dared open, was slowly swinging open. The door, the one the note warned him about. Something, or someone, was waiting for him down there. He could feel it. His body screamed at him to run, to leave, to get out of the house, but his feet wouldn't move. His eyes were drawn to the dark doorway at the end of the hall. Without thinking, he took a step toward it. The door opened wider, and he could just make out a shadow in the darkness below. A figure, standing at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, didn't even breathe, but David knew it was waiting for him. "David!" The whisper came again, this time louder, coming from the basement itself. The voice was no longer faint. It was clear and chilling, as if it were right behind him. David's heart thudded in his chest as he took a step back. But before he could turn to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him in the hallway. The whispering intensified, now a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others demanding. He turned, his pulse racing, and sprinted for the front door. But the air around him felt thick, like the house itself was closing in. The whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, his screams. As he reached for the door handle, it twisted, and the door opened, only to reveal the same shadowy figure from the basement, now standing in front of him. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but David could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, its eyes boring into him. The whispering ceased, and in the silence, the figure finally spoke. "Stay. You belong to us now." The corpse in the attic. Rachel Stone had always been drawn to old houses. There was something comforting about their creaky floors, their faded wallpaper, the smell of history that lingered in the corners. When she found an apartment in an old Victorian building on the edge of town, she was thrilled. The rent was affordable, the space was spacious, and the building had character, everything she was looking for. But as soon as she stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over her. It was hard to describe, like the house was too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. She brushed the feeling aside. It was just an old building after all. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Rachel settled into her routine, work, errands, and spending her evenings curled up with a book or watching TV. The apartment was charming, with high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of natural light. But as time went on, she started to notice small things that didn't quite add up. It started with the sounds. At night, when she was lying in bed, she could hear faint noises from above. At first, she assumed it was the neighbors above her, people moving furniture, walking around, or perhaps a light fixture rattling in the wind. But the noises were different. They were more deliberate, as if someone were creeping around in the attic. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, Rachel decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The door to the attic was old, its wood warped with age, and it had a lock that hadn't been used in years. The smell of dust and mildew hit her as soon as she pushed the door open, and she turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. The attic was full of old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the remains of what looked like an old storage space. But what caught her eye was something in the corner, an old trunk covered in dust, its lid slightly ajar. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she approached it, her breath shallow. She didn't know why, but something about the trunk felt wrong. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of her. Slowly she lifted the lid. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. A body. At first, she thought it was some sort of mannequin, an old, decayed figure wrapped in a tattered sheet. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized with a sickening lurch that it was no mannequin. It was a human body, preserved in some horrific way. The skin was shriveled, the face contorted in a grotesque expression of pain. The limbs were twisted, unnatural, as though the person had been forced into the trunk long after death. Rachel stumbled backward, her heart racing. She dropped the flashlight and it rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She gasped for air, her legs trembling beneath her. What had she just found? The answer came quickly, though she wished it hadn't. A scrap of yellowed paper tucked into the folds of the sheet caught her eye. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. "If you are reading this, it means they have found me. They will find you too, and when they do, you will never leave this place." Rachel's stomach twisted as she read the words, her pulse quickening. The room felt colder now, the air thick with dread. It wasn't just a body, it was a warning for whoever came next. Panic surged through her. She had to get out of there. She turned to run, but as she reached for the door, she froze. The sounds from above had returned, but this time they were closer than ever. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing louder with each passing second. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The attic door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the small, dark room. She turned around in a frantic panic, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. The room was still empty, except for the corpse in the trunk. Then she heard a whisper, soft, like the rustling of a breeze. "Rachel." Her name, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She spun around, her flashlight darting from one corner to the other. The room was closing in on her. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very walls of the house were alive, watching her, waiting for her next move. "Rachel, you should have left." The whisper grew louder, and as Rachel turned to the corner of the room, she saw them, the figures, pale, ghostly forms, standing motionless in the shadows. They were watching her, their eyes hollow and empty, their faces twisted in anguish. The floor creaked behind her. Rachel whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. A man stood there, his face hidden in the shadows, his body draped in a tattered cloak. His presence was suffocating, cold, and familiar. He stepped forward, his face coming into view. But when she saw it, she screamed. It was the same face as the corpse in the trunk. The man smiled, a twisted, unnerving grin that stretched across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward, her body shaking uncontrollably. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the man's face, inches from hers, his cold eyes filled with rage. And then there was only darkness. The sleep experiment. Jason Murphy had never been one to shy away from adventure. As a college student studying psychology, he was always looking for ways to test the boundaries of his own mind. So when he saw an advertisement for a sleep study that promised a substantial payout, he didn't think twice. The offer seemed too good to pass up. 3 weeks of observation, an all-expenses-paid stay at a state-of-the-art medical facility, and a chance to earn some extra cash. Jason was intrigued, but more than that, he was curious. What could they possibly be studying about sleep that would require such a long, intensive observation period? The facility was pristine, modern, sleek, and eerily quiet. It was situated on the outskirts of the city, a place where isolation could be guaranteed. Upon arrival, Jason was greeted by Dr. Phillips, the lead researcher for the experiment. The doctor was calm, professional, with an almost unsettling demeanor. He assured Jason that everything would be comfortable, that he would have his own room, and that he would be monitored through state-of-the-art equipment throughout the experiment. "I'm sure you'll find this fascinating," Dr. Phillips said with a thin smile. "We've been researching the deep phases of sleep and how it affects the brain, particularly in relation to memory consolidation and emotional regulation." Jason nodded, not fully understanding what Dr. Phillips meant, but excited to learn more. The first few nights went as expected. Jason slept in the sterile white room, hooked up to a series of monitors and electrodes that measured his brain activity, heart rate, and breathing patterns. Each morning, Dr. Phillips would check in on him, asking about his sleep, his dreams, and any unusual sensations. Jason reported nothing out of the ordinary, but soon things began to change. On the fourth night of the experiment, Jason had trouble falling asleep. It wasn't that he was particularly restless, it was just that something felt off. The room seemed too quiet, too still. The usual hum of the machines monitoring his vitals seemed louder in the silence, and Jason found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to relax. Around 2 a.m., Jason felt a strange sensation. A sudden shift in the air, cold, as though someone had opened a window. But the window was closed. The room was sealed. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the shadows, just outside his line of sight. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. But when he turned to look, the room was empty. There was nothing unusual, but the feeling didn't go away. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just the cold air. Jason heard a soft, low murmur, like someone whispering just beyond the walls. He pulled the covers over his head, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, around him, through the walls, inside his mind. He couldn't understand the words, but they felt invasive, oppressive. Jason's anxiety grew. He wasn't sure if the voices were real, or if he was just hearing things. He hadn't felt this way before, on edge, paranoid, as though something was watching him. By the third night, the whispers had become clearer. The words were now intelligible, though distorted, as if they were being spoken by multiple voices at once, overlapping and tangled together. Sleep. You must sleep. Sleep, or you'll be lost. Jason jerked awake, his body drenched in sweat. The whispers were still echoing in his ears, even as he sat up in bed, panting. His heart raced, his mind reeling. He needed to tell Dr. Phillips, but the doctor had assured him that the experiment was safe. He had signed a contract, agreeing to the full 3 weeks. And besides, what if this was part of the experiment? What if it was all a test of his mental endurance? But he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, Jason went to Dr. Phillips with a sense of urgency. He explained what had been happening, how he could hear the whispers, how they seemed to be getting louder, more desperate. Dr. Phillips listened patiently, his face unreadable. When Jason finished, the doctor simply nodded and made a few notes on his clipboard. Jason, you're experiencing what we call sensory overload. It's not unusual in this environment, Dr. Phillips explained calmly. The equipment, the constant monitoring, it can affect your perception of reality. We've been testing the limits of the human mind, and it appears you're more sensitive than most. But don't worry, you're safe. Just focus on your rest. Jason didn't buy it. There was something wrong. He could feel it in his bones, but he couldn't leave, not without risking everything he had signed up for. So, he did what he could. He tried to sleep. That night things escalated. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, loud, demanding, echoing inside his head. He heard them calling his name, beckoning him deeper into the abyss. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in. The air grew thick, suffocating. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as he reached for the buzzer beside his bed, but his hand couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He was paralyzed. The voices grew louder. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You will never wake up." The lights flickered, and then there was nothing. The whispers stopped. The pressure in his chest lifted. Jason found himself staring at the ceiling again, breathing heavily. His body was drenched in sweat, but his mind was blank. He felt empty, numb, like he had just come out of a nightmare that he couldn't quite remember. The morning came, and Jason was barely able to drag himself out of bed. He stumbled into the hallway, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. Dr. Phillips was waiting for him, as usual, clipboard in hand. "How did you sleep?" the doctor asked, his voice eerily calm. Jason started, but his voice cracked. He couldn't explain it. It was like a fog had descended over his mind, making it hard to think, to speak. "I think I need to leave. I can't stay here anymore." Dr. Phillips's expression didn't change. "You can't leave, Jason. Not yet. You haven't completed the experiment." Before Jason could respond, the doctor stepped forward, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. Jason froze. "You'll stay, or you'll never leave," Dr. Phillips said, his voice now completely devoid of emotion. Jason felt the world tilt beneath him. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Dr. Phillips's smiling face. But it wasn't the doctor anymore. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him. And then there was only darkness. The Vanishing Hotel. Michael Harper had always enjoyed road trips. There was something about the freedom of the open road, the promise of new places to discover, that kept him driving from one town to the next. But after a long day of driving through a stretch of desolate highway, he found himself in need of a place to stay for the night. The small town he'd passed through was quiet, and he was exhausted, so he pulled into a nearby hotel that seemed to appear out of nowhere, sitting on the edge of a winding road, the only building for miles. It was an old Victorian-style hotel, with tall, dark windows and ivy creeping up its sides. The lights in the windows flickered faintly, casting a soft glow that seemed inviting amidst the darkness. Michael didn't think much of it. It looked like a quaint, if slightly run-down, establishment. The lobby was empty when he walked in, save for an elderly man behind the front desk. His face was weathered, his skin wrinkled, but his eyes were sharp as he looked up from the book he was reading. "Welcome," the man said with a raspy voice. "I have a room for you, room 318. Michael nodded and handed over his ID and payment, not bothering to ask about the place. He just wanted to sleep. The man handed him an old-fashioned brass key with the number 318 engraved on it. "The elevator's out of service, I'm afraid," the man added with a faint smile. "But the stairs are just over there." Michael thanked him and walked to the staircase. As he climbed the narrow, creaking stairs, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the hotel seemed. It wasn't just the lack of people. It was the absence of sound altogether. No music, no sounds of conversation or activity. Just silence. It felt almost like the hotel was frozen in time. When he reached the third floor, he found room 318 at the end of a long corridor. The door was old, the paint chipped, but it opened easily with the key. Inside, the room was surprisingly spacious. The furniture was antique but well-preserved. A large king-sized bed covered in a faded quilt stood against one wall, and a heavy velvet curtain hung over the window, blocking the view of the dark night outside. Michael tossed his bag onto the bed and sat down, trying to relax. He was exhausted, and he knew he'd sleep well after such a long drive. But as he lay down, he noticed something odd. The bed seemed unusually soft, almost too soft. It sank beneath his weight more than it should, as though something beneath the mattress was pressing back against him. Curious, Michael lifted the mattress and peered underneath. There, to his shock, was a small, faded envelope resting on the floor. It was sealed with an old wax stamp, and the handwriting on the front of the envelope was elegant, almost too perfect. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he broke the seal and opened it. Inside, there was only one line written in fine script. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down his spine. Michael quickly shoved the envelope back under the mattress, dismissing it as a strange prank. He had to be tired, that was all. But as he tried to settle in for sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quietness of the hotel was unsettling, and the longer he lay there, the more he felt like he wasn't alone in the room. A sound broke through the stillness, the faintest rustling, as though someone was moving in the hallway just outside his door. Michael sat up, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it or if someone had actually walked by. He waited in silence, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then, the door to his room creaked open. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He leaped out of bed, his heart pounding. But when he turned to the door, it was closed, just as he had left it. Confused, he walked over to the door and checked the lock. It was secure. So why did he feel like someone had entered his room? And why did the air feel so heavy now, like he was being watched? His unease grew as the night wore on. At some point, he must have fallen asleep, but his dreams were restless. He tossed and turned, waking intermittently to the sound of whispers just out of earshot, a sound that seemed to come from the corners of the room. He couldn't make out the words, but the voices were there, soft, urgent, as if calling him to listen. Suddenly he jolted awake to the sound of a loud bang. He sat up in bed, sweat dripping down his forehead. The room was still, but something felt off. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but when he looked at it, the time on the screen didn't make sense. It read 3:18 a.m. "Must be a glitch," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But when he glanced around the room again, it felt different, darker, more oppressive. That was when he realized he hadn't been hearing things. The door was now wide open, not just cracked, open. He stood frozen, staring at the dark hallway outside. And then, with a creeping horror, he realized that the hallway wasn't just empty. There were people standing in the shadows. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale, their eyes vacant, their movements stiff and unnatural. Michael could see them clearly now. They were lined up down the hall, staring at him. The hotel lobby, the stairs, everything was wrong. He wasn't in a regular hotel anymore. The figures in the hallway began to move, slowly, their eyes fixed on him as they stepped closer to the door. Michael's breath quickened, panic flooding his chest. Without thinking, he bolted out of the room, down the hall, past the eerie figures that never moved their eyes from him. He reached the stairs, his footsteps pounding on the creaky wood, and ran down the flights as fast as he could. But when he reached the lobby, his heart sank. The lobby was empty. The man behind the desk was gone, and the lights were dim, casting shadows across the room. The exit door was locked. Michael rushed to the door, pounding on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. He turned to look around. The entire hotel seemed to have vanished, as though it no longer existed in the world he knew. The walls shifted, the hallway stretching further and further, and the air grew colder. Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, in a corner he hadn't noticed before, a figure stood, its back turned toward him. As it turned around, Michael saw the same pale face, the same empty eyes. The figure raised a hand, pointing at him, and then it spoke in a low, echoing voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." The Silent Hospital. Anna Reynolds, had never been one to believe in things that went bump in the night. As a nurse in a busy city hospital, she had seen things far scarier than any ghost story. Blood, trauma, death, those were the real horrors of the world, and they didn't need any supernatural embellishment. But one night, during a particularly grueling shift at the hospital, Anna's perspective on the unexplainable would change forever. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Anna entered the ward for her rounds. The hospital was mostly quiet at this hour, the usual bustle of nurses and doctors reduced to a few murmurs of distant conversations. Anna moved from room to room, checking on patients, adjusting IVs, and noting vital signs. But when she reached room 207, something felt different. The door was slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes patients would need help in the middle of the night, and the staff would leave the door open to hear them. What was strange, though, was the utter silence that seemed to emanate from within. There was no beeping from the machines, no rustling of bed sheets, no faint sounds of breathing, nothing. Anna's brow furrowed. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the machines on the bedside table. But what struck Anna immediately was the patient in the bed, an elderly woman, lying completely still, her eyes wide open. The woman's gaze was fixed on the ceiling, and she wasn't moving. Anna quickly approached the bed, checking the monitor. It wasn't displaying anything alarming. It showed a steady heartbeat and normal oxygen levels. But the woman's eyes, wide and unblinking, were unnerving. "Mrs. Clark?" Anna said gently, trying to wake her, but the woman didn't respond. She checked the woman's pulse. Steady. Then she moved to adjust the blanket. But as her hand brushed against the woman's wrist, she felt a sudden coldness, a coldness that went beyond the temperature of the room. It was unnatural, like a presence, something that didn't belong. Anna stepped back, unease settling in her stomach. There was something wrong about this room. Something wasn't right. The lights flickered overhead and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. It came from the woman on the bed. "Help! Me!" Anna froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman's lips hadn't moved, but the voice was unmistakable. Who are you?" Anna whispered, her voice shaky. The woman's unblinking eyes shifted slightly, just enough to show that she was aware of Anna's presence. But the voice came again, soft and desperate, as if it were coming from somewhere deep inside her. "I'm trapped. In here. I can't get out." The air grew colder still, and Anna's breath misted in front of her. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. The machines began to make faint, static noises, their once steady hums now distorting into irregular bursts of sound. The lights flickered more violently now, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. "Please, help me," the voice whispered, closer now, almost in Anna's ear. "I've been here too long. I can't breathe." Anna stepped back again, feeling a growing sense of panic rising in her chest. Her mind raced. Was she imagining this? Could she be hallucinating from exhaustion? But no, this wasn't just in her head. She could feel it, the cold, the heaviness in the air, the sensation that something was desperately trying to reach out from the woman's body, something trapped inside. Without thinking, Anna rushed to the bedside table and grabbed the emergency call button. She pressed it repeatedly, but nothing happened. The room remained still, too still. "Please," the voice continued, now more frantic. "I can't leave. I'm still here." Anna stumbled backward, her body shaking as the walls seemed to close in around her. She turned and bolted out of the room, running down the corridor to the nurse's station. She couldn't explain it. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in that room. She grabbed the first nurse she saw and told her about what happened. Together they rushed back to room 207, but when they opened the door, the room was completely normal. The woman was still lying in the bed, her eyes closed. The monitors were working perfectly, showing her vitals as steady as ever. The coldness had vanished, and the lights were shining brightly. Anna felt a lump form in her throat. "But I heard her. She was awake. She was talking." The nurse looked at her with a confused expression. "Anna, Mrs. Clark passed away 2 days ago. We've been waiting for her body to be removed." Anna's stomach dropped. Her mind reeled. She looked back at the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the woman's peaceful face, now as lifeless as any corpse should be. But the whispers, the voice, still echoed in her mind, like a lingering presence that wouldn't leave. Later that night, Anna went back to the room alone. The hospital was quieter now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more. She walked back down the sterile hallway to room 207. The door was still open. As she entered the room, she noticed something different. On the nightstand beside the bed was a small photo frame. It was a picture of the woman when she was younger, standing with a man and a child, her family. But the photo wasn't what caught Anna's attention. What made her blood run cold was the faintest writing on the back of the frame, written in what looked like a child's hand. "I never got to say goodbye." Anna's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned toward the bed, her eyes widening as she saw the woman's eyes, still open, still unblinking, staring at her. And then a whisper, once again, filled the room. "Thank you for hearing me." The room was silent again. The room with no door. Emily Parker was no stranger to strange occurrences. As a seasoned journalist with a focus on paranormal investigations, she had experienced her fair share of eerie situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the case that would change her life. It all began when Emily was hired by a local historical society to write about a centuries-old mansion on the edge of town, a place that had long been abandoned and left to decay. The mansion was a relic of the past, and though it had been the subject of many ghost stories, it had never attracted much attention, until now. The society was interested in preserving what little remained of the house and wanted Emily to write a feature piece on its history and potential. She arrived at the mansion one crisp autumn afternoon, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, ready to document the crumbling structure. The mansion had an eerie beauty to it, with ivy creeping up the sides and the faint scent of mildew in the air. The moment she stepped inside, she was struck by the silence. It was so thick, so oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Emily took a few photos, walking through the large, dust-covered rooms, trying to get a feel for the place. The mansion had a grand staircase, a massive chandelier, and rooms filled with antique furniture long forgotten. But there was something strange about the house, a sensation that she couldn't quite shake. As she explored further, Emily came across a door at the far end of a long hallway. It was unlike any door she had seen before. It was solid wood, old and intricate. But what struck her most was that there was no handle, no keyhole, no way to open it. Curiosity tugged at her. She tried pushing the door, pulling it, but it didn't budge. There was no indication of a way to access whatever lay behind it. She moved around it, looking for any signs of a hidden latch or trick mechanism, but there was nothing. Just a door, with no way to open it. She stood there for several minutes, contemplating whether to leave, but something urged her to stay. The silence in the house seemed to grow louder, pressing against her like an invisible force. She knew she had to figure out what was behind that door. There was a compulsion she couldn't explain, a feeling that she had been drawn to this very moment. After several minutes of frustration, she gave up and walked away, but she couldn't shake the thought of that door. It haunted her as she moved through the house, taking pictures of the remaining rooms. The further she explored, the more she became aware of a strange energy in the house, an energy that felt off, like she was being watched. But every time she turned around, no one was there. It was only as the evening light began to fade that she decided to leave. Her car was parked outside, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. But before she could step out of the front door, she felt it again, that pull, that need to go back to the door. Without even thinking, Emily found herself walking down the hallway again, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. She reached the door and stopped. It was still there, standing silent and ominous, like a black hole in the middle of the hallway. This time, something was different. As she stood in front of it, she noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath the door. It was a soft, pulsating light, as though something was alive on the other side. Her heart raced, and before she could think twice, her hand was on the door. To her surprise, the door opened easily this time, as if it had been waiting for her. The room behind it was unlike any room she had expected. It wasn't full of dust or decay. It was pristine, as if it had been untouched for centuries. The walls were lined with ornate wallpaper, the floor covered in a plush carpet. In the center of the room, there was an old wooden chair facing a wall that seemed to stretch on forever. The room itself was small, but its proportions felt wrong, too wide, too deep, as if it extended beyond the physical dimensions of the mansion. Emily stepped inside, her feet falling heavily on the soft carpet. As she walked deeper into the room, she felt the temperature drop. The chill was unbearable, and her breath misted in front of her. She looked around, her camera ready, but something in the room felt off, unnatural. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing, watching her every move. She turned her gaze toward the wall where the chair was facing, but when she looked closer, she realized it wasn't a wall at all. It was a mirror, a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, cracked and warped, reflecting nothing but darkness. As she stared into it, she began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though the mirror wasn't just reflecting her image, it was pulling her in, drawing her closer to something dark. Suddenly a voice broke the silence. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shock through her body. Her hands trembled as she reached for her camera, but before she could take another step, she felt a cold hand wrap around her wrist. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing behind her, but the grip on her wrist tightened. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The room seemed to spin around her. The air thickened, suffocating her as she felt herself being pulled toward the mirror. Her feet couldn't move, her body frozen in place. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room. It was reflecting something else, something that was not her. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, stood in the center of the mirror, its features unclear but its eyes locked on hers. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. "It's too late now," the voice whispered again, louder, more urgent this time. With all her strength, Emily wrenched herself free from the unseen force pulling her into the mirror. She stumbled backward, falling to the floor. But the room remained unchanged. The figure in the mirror was gone. The door was closed again. Gasping for air, Emily scrambled to her feet, not daring to look back at the mirror. She ran out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the mansion, not stopping until she was in her car, driving away, the mansion fading in her rearview mirror. The door behind her would remain locked for another 100 years. But Emily knew what she had seen. She had opened a door that should have remained shut, and now something was following her.